There are a bunch of ways to cut out objects and people in Photoshop, and different techniques are required for different types of images. So today I'm going to show you how you can do it in Photoshop by covering a whole bunch of these techniques and give you an understanding of how to get the job done. To cover the basic process, I'm going to cut out one of these tiles and pop it on this background. So what I'm going to do to get you started, I'm going to go up top here to my marquee tools and choose this square. And if I zoom in, I'm using Alt and the mouse wheel, I can just use this square to select this M. What I can do is go to Edit, Copy, and then I can just paste it in place and turn off this layer, and it's there. It's not cut out too well, but you get the idea. But what's even better, if I can't do that, is I can even go to Select, Inverse, and then I can hit Delete on my keyboard to delete the rest of the layer, and then I just have this and then any out of bounds there, which can be a little bit cumbersome as well. So I go Control Z, undo. So what I really want to do is once I've made my selection, I go down the bottom right here, I have the layer selected, and I click this little square with a circle to mask that layer. So essentially we need to create a selection and then mask that layer for most techniques, and we're going to cover a bunch of those. So now, different shapes and images require different tools. One example is this ball. If I go up the top here to my square selection and hold down, I can click the elliptical marquee tool and draw. I can also hold down Shift to get a perfect circle, and then I can let go and sort of move that into place and then mask that layer as well. What I can also do is I can actually go down to Quick Mask down here, and then I can treat it like an object. I can actually go to Edit, Free Transform, and I can move that around, resize it. I can even get my paintbrush, and whenever I paint in white, will also get cut out. And whenever I paint in black, will not be cut out. So I exit my Quick Mask or hit Q on my keyboard, and now I have this object. I click Mask, and I can actually now cut something out a little bit more custom. The next tool I have is my Lasso tool, and if I've got a steady hand, I can actually do a pretty decent selection because I can just draw it on there. But I don't get these nice straight lines because it's all freehand. But that can be helpful if you're happy to do that. I'm going to hit Control D on my keyboard or Command D, deselect. But if I hold down, I can choose the Polygon Lasso tool, and I click and create points, and I can actually create a selection by clicking point to point and doing it that way. Another tip you can use while using that Polygon Lasso tool is actually to zoom in using either your magnifying glass here, or I hold down Alt and the mouse wheel. I can actually zoom in and I can click and do this piece by piece and get some okay results. But it gets difficult when I get to the edge of the screen. I hold space on my keyboard and I can drag this up and then keep going. And then when I'm done, if I zoom out, I can just complete this selection here, and I have that. A better tool for something like this is actually, if I hold down again in the Lasso tool, the magnetic Lasso tool, where I can simply draw and click, and it will kind of snap to the nearest line or object, and I can get a pretty good result cutting out with that. But I need to hit backspace if I make a mistake, and I can keep going that way. And of course, I can then come around and finish the cutout there. So I have this edge cut out nicely, and I could spend time cutting out the whole thing, but for the sake of the video, we won't do that. Another thing to be aware of when using selection tools is if I decide I want to add to my selection, I can go here, choose any one of my selection tools I've just shown. I can hold down Shift, and you see a little plus symbol, and I can add to the selection. If I hold down Alt, I can remove from the selection. So you can see how I'm able to affect my selection by adding and subtracting to it by holding down Shift. The other thing I can do is if I want to remove this sky, I can actually click this magic wand tool and just click into the background, and it will select the color I click. The problem is that's not necessarily the best way to do it either, and sometimes if you zoom in, you get weird little artifacts. I can change the tolerance. If I put the tolerance up here down to 10, it will select less. If I crank that tolerance up to 100, it selects a lot more. So the tolerance affects how much that this magic wand tool will actually select. But if I really want to select the sky, I can go up to Select, Sky, and Photoshop will automatically select the sky for me. I do have to make some adjustments if you zoom in here, But I can simply get a lasso tool, hold down Alt, and remove that. And now I can go select, inverse, or Control-Shift-I, mask that layer. And if I select a sky, like this one, I hit Control-A to select all, Control-C to copy. I can Control-V to paste, or go to Edit and Paste. And I can move this underneath that layer and adjust the sky into position. Another cool feature is Object Selection Tool. I can actually hover over objects, I hold down Shift, and I can select objects on the scene. And sometimes you get different results by clicking. I click Shift, and I can add these objects, and then I can mask those as well. Now, it's not 100% perfect all the time. You do get some issues, but you can easily adjust these using Select and Mask. Before I get into Select and Mask, the next one I want to show you is Select Subject. So I've got this person here. I go to Select Subject, and it will select the person in the picture or the main object of that picture. If you were had different objects in different focus, you could also go to Select Focus Area and adjust the focus range. This isn't the best picture for that, but you can see how, since she is in focus, it's kind of selected her there. But for now, we're going to actually go Select Subject. And what I can do now is I can go here and I can mask this layer. And I can right click and go to Select and Mask. And I have a whole bunch of tools I can use here to work on that selection. However, if I go back, undo that, as long as I have this selection, I can also go to my Select tool and click Select and Mask at the top here. Or perhaps the best way of doing it is to cancel, is to turn off the selection altogether. And as long as I have one of these selection tools highlighted, I go to Select and Mask first. And you'll see I've lost the picture. If I go up the top here to View, I can change it to Overlay. And I can see her again, and nothing is selected, which is why we have all red and why it was all blank. So if I go up the top here to Select Subject, I now have my subject selected, and I can start to work on my selection. Before I do that, I can actually go to View, and if I put this on white, and I move this opacity, I can move that up and down. I can see that if I pop her on a light background, the hair is going to blend in pretty well. However, if I go to View and put on black, I can see there's some white artifacts in her hair, and I need to make some adjustments. To go through, I can also choose different ways that the selection will be chosen when I'm making these settings. There's Color Aware, which will actually compare the color of the hair to the background, or the color of the object to the background around it, and it will change the selection. Now that actually does look a little bit better, but I'm going to go back to Object Aware, and you can see it's probably a little bit more clumpy. So I think because it actually seems to be a little bit more detailed, I'm going to go with Color Aware, and I can go to my radius and I can change this to get different levels of selection. You can see it's kind of refined that edge a bit, but it's also chopped into the shoulders a little. I'm going to bring that back. About there is looking pretty good. And I can go down here, and I don't necessarily want to do it with this image, but I can smooth my selection. And so we get this really smooth edge on the selection. So if you're cutting out an object that is smoother, that can work really well. I'm going to dial that back. I can feather, which if you look at this hard edge down here, I can feather, which you look at this hard edge down here, I will try to zoom in. With this feather, I can blur the edge. So in some instances, that may be useful. In this one, if I zoom out, you can see it just kind of adds a glow and is not very good. So we'll bring that all the way back. With the contrast, we can also knock that up. And by contrast, it means the contrast of the mask. If I go up here to View and Black and White, if I zoom in here, you can see there's lots of grays. By going in and adjusting the contrast, it makes that harsher and therefore makes the selection harsher. So now if I go back to on black, you can see it's a much harsher selection, very rough, not a lot of grays, which means not a lot of sort of like refinement from the edge to the cutout. So I'm going to bring that contrast back, maybe knock it up slightly. Now Shift Edge means I can bring the edge of the selection into the image or out. If I bring this all the way out, it moves the selection out. If I bring it all the way in, it cuts right into the picture in not a very helpful way. In the middle is about right. I can actually bring that in a little bit if I want to refine that hair a bit further. And now the edge is looking a bit better. We still have some problems with colors and white, so I can also scroll down. I can also invert the selection if I want to. There's a decontaminate colors setting here. If I click on that, it's actually decontaminated some of the color around the hair, which is pretty cool. Hasn't done a perfect job. There's still some issues, but it's pretty good. And I can also change that amount, dial it back, but I want to keep it up because I really want to keep that hair pretty well decontaminated, which is pretty cool. Now, before I go any further, I could leave it at that if I want to. There's actually some issues with the shoulders, so I'm going to cover that with another technique in a minute. But I want to adjust some of the white out of here. So I'm going to zoom in, and I have some tools on the left over here. These are tools I can add or subtract with my selection. First thing is, if I actually have these, I can click Refine Hair, and it will actually automatically go through and try to refine that hair. So that's actually not too bad. But now we have a bit missing down here. If I select this brush here, I can paint back in. Now this first brush I'm using is actually not a brush, it's just a simple select tool. So if I want to, I can actually go to negative and I can select objects and it will automatically just remove them. And I don't want to do that, but it's great for adding in areas like what I did over here and subtracting. What I can do is also a refine edge tool or simply a brush. So if I get this brush, change my brush size, I can literally just add information back in by drawing it back in there. If I click minus, once again, I'll bring my brush up. I can remove that information. And with this edge tool, I can refine the edge by drawing. I can change. So by adding plus, it helps to refine that edge and make it a bit better. And the minus kind of adds some of it back in. So you got these cool tools that are pretty awesome at making these adjustments. But once again, if I remove a bit, we have got a bit of an issue over here. And once again, I can also use these other tools such as the object selection tool to select objects. At the moment, it's just selecting her. I can use the Lasso tool if I want to and add him back in sections like that. And of course, I can use the zoom in and out and use the hand to move around. But for now, I'm going to stick with that. I'm pretty happy with it as it is. I'm going to click OK. I'm going to add an image into the background just so we can see how it looks. So I'm going to simply add a new layer under the cutout layer, paste in my image, and we can see how well the hair has blended. Now, one thing we can do even after we've left select and mask is maybe this bit of hair here shouldn't be transparent. I can click on the mask, get my standard brush tool over here, using white, bringing my brush size down, I can reintroduce information into that mask so it appears and revives some of that image. I want to be very careful not to get too caught up in the little hair bits there because it might not look as good. But so far, so good. I can add some back in here if I think that's going to be some of her head and not transparent. And get a better result that way. Another thing I can do is her shoulders are very fuzzy. And I can actually use this to create selections or I can use it to refine. I'm going to go over here to the pen tool. And this is another great way to cut things out manually. I can click a dot, click and hold, and then I can use these handles here to create curves. So if I actually go back, zoom in a little bit, you hold down spacebar to move around. I can click and hold, click, and then I can just simply cut across to here and reselect those shoulders and get a much sharper line. So this is actually now an object. It's a shape. Depending on how you have this set up, it may also simply be a path. But either way, if I set this to shape before I start, I can control click on this layer to produce a selection. I turn the layer off, and what I can do is I can either click on this mask, and then I can just simply put the white section on the right and hit delete, and it will revive that portion of the image. If I don't want to do that and I want to keep the mask intact, I'll just undo by hitting Control Z. And with the same selection, I can actually click on this image and I can drag it down with the plus symbol to create a second version. I right click on the mask and I delete the layer mask on the copy, and then I remask down here, and I now have two objects. So I can turn the shoulders on or off, and I can actually then create a hard selection of other areas if I think they need it. So that's a very handy tool. And again, I can see through her hair here. So I can even use this selection tool to do that, or I can simply go back into the mask again, make sure that I'm using white, and add that back in. So you can see how the hair sits over the background pretty effectively. We've still got a little bit of a scenario here where things are looking a little strange. So I'm going to click on the shoulders and just sort of refine that a bit. So I'm going to click have black on here, grab my brush, and just very easily adjust those shoulders. And the reason I have that second layer is quite apparent now, because I'm not actually affecting the hair. I can actually adjust the shoulders and solid areas without affecting the hair. So it's pretty handy to have separate layers like that. Now I've actually removed from the shoulder. I believe I should have added. So I'm going to increase that again, add that back in. There are some weird effects here. However, it's probably come from decontaminating the hair. So another thing I can do is even just hold down, Control, select on this mask. I can copy the bottom layer again, move it up, and mask that, and then remove. This is why it's always good to keep a copy of the original in place. I turn it back on, and now we don't have that issue. So sometimes cutting things out is a case of using multiple layers, so you can get the best result. Overall, I think that looks pretty good. I'm pretty happy with it. So now we have this cut out, and another thing we need to be concerned about when we're cutting out objects in Photoshop is the fact that she doesn't really match the background. The dark shadows are much lighter than the background, so it doesn't look like a natural blend. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to highlight these two. I'm going to hold Shift, select both of these layers. I'm going to go up the top here, Convert to Smart Object, and then I'm going to just zoom out a little bit and go to Image, Adjustments, and Curves. I'm going to just move her across by holding down space, and I can now start to move. I can see here I've got black on the bottom, white at the top, black on the left, white on the right. If I move this into the gray area, it darkens because it's taking the information of the image, which is the black information here, and moving it into a darker area. So when I adjust this bottom left-hand corner, because it's near the black, it will adjust the darkness. But if I change and go to the right where the white aligns, I can increase the light and get a better balance. Now that's obviously not a good balance, so I'm going to reset. So I can now just adjust this, bring it in, and get that color, that darkness looking a little bit better. And if I feel like it needs to match the background, like the tone of the background needs, maybe she's not the right color against that, I can make further adjustments by clicking on my smart filters and curves. And then I can actually split these colors and go further. That's a topic for another video, but by splitting this up and going into, say, the red, I can make adjustments to introduce some more red, and I can adjust separate color to yellow her a bit more, and I can actually then adjust the color of that image pretty effectively too. But overall, that's a really great method for cutting people out. I actually highly recommend when you're cutting out an object, I recommend going to Select and Mask first, choosing the overlay, and then you can actually start working on your selection from there. However, sometimes you don't get the results you want, and you might want to use the pen tool. Now I use the pen tool for sharp objects when I want complete control, which I used before, but once again, if I click on this pen tool, I can draw very precisely, create very precise curves, and even if I mess up a curve down here, So that's pretty rough. I can take this shape, bring the opacity down. I can hold down Alt and use my mouse wheel to zoom in, and I can take this section and fix it. So I'm going to go back into my little white pointer tool. I click on the dot and I can sort of move it across, adjust this handle, whoops, adjust this handle to adjust the curve, and I can now adjust that path. I can adjust this curve here. Now this point is a bit more difficult. So I'm going to go over here to my pen tool, choose Convert Point Tool, so we get this option here. I click on this point and drag, and I can turn it into a curve. I now do my hold and select. That's a bit of a rough selection, but you get the idea. We go through, refine, turn this layer off, click on this layer and mask. Now we have a nice clean selection. So those are pretty much all of the main methods you can use to cut out objects in Photoshop. There's endless ways of doing it, but thanks for sitting through that video. Relatively long one, but I think there's a lot of good information in there. If you like the video, please consider giving it a like. If you want more videos on Photoshop, check out my channel. Otherwise, have a great day and see you next time.